We don't always get our needs met. Now, here in the West, we often do get our needs met. But there's people around the world who pray for their needs to be met and still basically starve. There's people who starve. There's people who suffer. Do they have less faith than we do? Does God not care? Yes, he cares. But he hasn't promised us some of the things we think he's promised us. And that's why we get disillusioned and waffled in our face so much, is because we go through terrible things, or we see other Christians do terrible things, and then we question our faith. Well, is Christianity real? And the writer of Hebrews is saying, why is your faith in those things? So what are the things the Old Testament saints were confident of? And the answer is, were they hoping for miracles in this life? No. The things they were hoping for were the promises that were tied to the Messiah. They weren't confident that everything would turn out good for them in this lifetime. And we saw at the end of chapter 11 in Hebrews that many of them didn't have things turn out good in this lifetime. They died early. They died destitute. They died afflicted. Some of them really suffered. Some of them really were looked down upon. Yet they were confident of things hoped for because they were hoping for something else. They were hoping for a Messiah who would come to earth and bring peace and justice and healing and goodness to God's earth and all the families of the earth. So, the evidence of their faith was not that they saw many miracles and that their lives always turned out for good in this lifetime. Some of them saw miracles, some of them didn't. Some of them took on big things and did great things for God. Some of them we'll never know about because they just lived less than ordinary, afflicted lives. Okay? The evidence of their faith was not whether they did big things for God. The evidence of their faith was that they believed that God would send a Messiah, and they lived in light of that truth, whether their prayers got answered or whether they didn't. Whether they did accomplish big things or whether they didn't. Whether things turned out good for them or whether they didn't. Now let me prove to you that this is the context of Hebrews 11. That faith, what is faith? Faith is not, seeing all of your prayers answered, even though people with faith can see prayers answered. But sometimes people with faith don't. Let me show you that faith is actually about putting your faith in a good God who's going to make everything all right someday, not in things turning all right now. And we're going to go to the verses right before Hebrews chapter 11. Because remember, there's no chapter headings in the original. So all of this is just one letter. Let me go to the words and the sentences that the writer of Hebrews is speaking right before chapter 11. And let me show you the context that the writer of Hebrews is speaking into. Here's what he says, starting in chapter 10, verse 32. But recall the former days when, after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle. A hard struggle with suffering, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach. People were saying terrible things about the early Christians and spreading lies about them and smearing their character, okay? And affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property. They lost businesses, they lost homes, they lost money, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Look at what they're hoping in, something in this lifetime or something to come, and it's something to come. Now the question is, what's the writer of Hebrews going to say next? Now I've kind of given it away already. Is he going to say, look, you guys have gone through all this hard stuff. Now here, let me just pump you up a bit. If you just have faith, it's all going to go away. If you just have faith and pray really hard, things are going to all turn around. Well, let's look at this. Verse 35, therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. So it looks like, build up your confidence. Confidence in what? Verse 36, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. This isn't a pump-up message that everything's going to turn around. This is an endurance message. The writer of Hebrews is not writing chapter 11 to pump up people's faith so that they'll pray big prayers for God, even though it's good to pray, big things. I'm not against praying big things for God. Not at all. I'm just saying that's not what Hebrews 11 is talking about. This isn't a pump-up passage. If you just pray bigger prayers, you're going to see God do bigger miracles. That's not what it is. This is a message of faith to take people through a time when they're not going to see answers to prayer. That's why he's telling them to endure. The afflictions, the plundering of their property, the reproach, the character assassination is not about to end. And so he's exhorting them to have faith in spite of the fact that those things are going to carry on. So what is the thing promised? Look there's that word promise again at the end of that verse 36. So when you've done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. So what's the thing promised that they're meant to look forward to? Verse 37, he's going to quote from the Old Testament now. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. Is the promise he's exhorting them to the promise that everything's going to turn out good in this lifetime, that God won't let you go through a whole bunch of suffering, that things will always make sense, that the pieces of your life will always fit together perfectly like a puzzle that'll make sense and show you how much purpose God has for you? You know what? Life is a lot messier than that. And when it gets a lot messier than that, you don't have to question your faith. You don't have to question somebody else's faith, because faith does not mean that you live a nice, clean life and it all makes sense and it all turns out and you get all your prayers answered the way you want. That's not how it works. Your faith is meant to be in what is to come, that the messianic promise is that someday God will set up his kingdom on earth and he will bring an end to death and pain and sin and suffering. And we are to live in light of that promise, to hold on to our faith in Jesus Christ, whether things are good or whether things are bad. That's what strong faith is. Hanging on to Jesus, worshiping him and remaining loyal to him, whether things are good or whether things are bad. And so we come back to Hebrews 11. I should finish reading that passage here. But my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their soul. See, faith is about preserving your soul, not preserving your circumstances. Okay? And again, it's not bad. It is not bad to pray for relief. It's not bad to pray for healing. We should do that as children. We go to the Father. But don't have your faith shaken when those things don't always get answered. They just don't. So how do we live by faith today? How do we live by faith today? Okay? And the first thing we have to understand is that we have a huge advantage over the Old Testament saints. They believed in a promise that they had no evidence for. They were looking forward to something. They were looking forward to something they didn't understand, and yet they lived, whether in a difficult life or whether in a less difficult life. They believed in the promise that God would send a Messiah, and they lived in light of that promise. They had faith. Guess what? We have a huge advantage over them today because we've already seen part of the promise answered. That's the cross. See, they were looking forward to something they couldn't see. We can now look backwards to something we can see. God actually took on flesh. He came down and lived as a man named Jesus. Then he died on a cross and he rose again from the grave. We need to view faith through the lens of the cross. The Old Testament saints looked forward to something and couldn't see any of it. We look backwards to something we can see. That is the down payment of what is to come, that someday God will fulfill the whole promise, which is for Jesus to return to earth and bless all of us, families of the earth, with a kingdom where there is no more death or pain or suffering or sickness or sadness anymore. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you want to hear the whole message, you can click on the link here. And if you want to hear more messages and not miss anything, be sure to subscribe. Leave us a comment. We love answering questions.